Good morning. Today I will be reading from the Left Behind series. I'm going to be reading the book Indwelling, and this is the seventh book in the Left Behind series. Today I am going to be reading chapter 4, and I'll begin to read now. It was to Rayford's advantage that the global community had rendered the whole of Greece virtually invisible. In relining the world into 10 regions with subpotents, which Tyson bin Judah insisted were kingdoms with kings. The United Holy Land States had appropriated Greece. Her potentate had lobbied for independence, as most countries' leaders had, then pleaded for membership as one of the United European states. Carpathia himself had mollified the Greeks with a personal visit and several appearances during which he took full responsibility for their inclusion in his region. Lucas Laszlos Miklos had once regaled Rayford with a dead-on imitation of the potent's Eastern-flavored Greek as he flattered the nation into compliance. "You are a deeply religious people," Carpathia had told them, "with a rich place in the histories of many cherished belief systems. You are nearly as close to the cradle of civilization as you are to the United European States. So I personally argued for your inclusion as a Holy Land state. My own origins are not that far north of you. The line of demarcation that puts both my homeland and my current residence in the same region naturally includes Greece as well. I welcome you to my region and trust you will enjoy the benefits from this area's housing the New World capital." That had won over the majority of Greeks. One huge benefit to tribulation saints was that Greece seemed to boast suspicion as a spring of rebellion. The exploding church there went underground immediately. Worried that it might otherwise draw the attention of the GC, Dr. Ben Judah corresponded with nearly 1,000 Greek evangelists he had identified as likely part of the prophecy 144,000 witnesses. These were Messianic Jews, many of whom had attended the Great Conference of Witnesses in Israel and had returned to their homeland to win tens of thousands of converts to Christ. Mr. and Mrs. Miklos own a local body of underground believers, had mushroomed so that the original assembly had split many times and now met as more than 100 small groups that weren't really so small. The new corporate church was too large to ever meet together without jeopardizing its clandestine identity. The witness leaders of each faction met monthly for training and mutual encouragement, and of course the entire body counted itself part of the new worldwide band of believers, with Tyson bin Judah as its de facto cyberspace pastor-teacher. The covert nature of the Greek church, while clearly not impeding its evangelistic efforts, served to keep from waving a red flag before the GC. Buck Williams' private investigation for his cyber magazine, The Truth, found with the help of ultimate hacker David Hassid that Greece was all but ignored by GC counterintelligence, security, and peacekeeping forces. The country was low maintenance. Most of the forces assigned there had been redeployed into Israel for Gala and New Babylon for its aftermath. Thus, it was not a surprise to Rayford to find that the tiny airport in Potomac was not only closed and unmanned, but also dark. He had neither the light power nor the confidence to land on an unlit runway with a plane as powerful and tricky as the Gulfstream. He overflew the airfield a few times, not wanting to draw attention to himself, then headed south about 25 miles to Kozani, and its larger airport. It too was closed, but one runway remained lit for emergencies and private cargo carriers. Rayford watched a wide-body international delivery craft put down, waited until it had taxied toward the colossal commercial hangars, then set his instruments for landing. He didn't know how he would get hold of Laszlo's or find a ride to Potomas. Perhaps he would be close enough to use his phone without relying on satellite technology. He hated to bother the Mikloses at this hour, but he'd done it before. They always understood. In fact, it seemed they loved the intrigue of the underground, Mrs. Miklos as much as Lucas. Rayford was strangely calm as he descended into Kozani. He believed he had made intimate contact with God during the flight, had communicated more directly, and felt more personally connected to heaven than he had in ages. This had come when Rayford finally heeded the scripture, "Be still and know that I am God." After months of rationalizing self-defense and taking matters into his own hands, he had finally given up and sought God. His first overwhelming emotion was shame. God had entrusted him, a brand new believer, with the scope of leadership. God had used the gifts he had bestowed on Rayford to direct the little band of believers that had become known as the Tribulation Force. Smarter people were in the force, Rayford knew, including his own daughter and son-in-law. And where on earth was a more brilliant mind than that of Tyson Ben Judah? And yet they all naturally looked to Rayford for leadership. He had not sought it, nor did he hoard it, but he had been willing, and as the force grew, so did his responsibility. But though his capacity could have expanded with the scope of his charge, the illogical had invaded. The man who had prided himself in his pragmaticism found himself living by his emotions. At first, becoming attuned to his emotions had been revelatory. It had allowed him to care deeply for his daughter, to really grieve over the loss of his wife and son, and to understand how much he had loved them. It had allowed him to see himself for who he was, to understand his need for forgiveness, to come to Christ. But, understandably, Rayford had found it difficult to balance his emotion and his intellect. No one could argue that he had been through more than his share of loss and trauma in 3.5 years. But the emotion necessary to round him out as a new believer somehow overrode the level-headed temperament that made him a natural leader. Never one for psychobabble, when Rayford opened himself to God that night in his spirit, he saw his failure for what it was, sin. He had become selfish, angry, vengeful. He had tried to take God's place as defender and protector of the tribulation force. In the process, he had left them more vulnerable than ever to danger. As Rayford dared peek at himself in that spiritual mirror, he hated what he saw. Here was a man who had been wholly grateful to God for his forgiveness and love and salvation, now living as a maverick. He still called himself a believer. But what had happened to his dependence upon God, upon the counsel of his friends and relatives and spiritual mentors? What had happened to his love for the Bible and prayer, and for the guidance he had once found there? As God seemed to shine the light of truth into his soul, Rayford pleaded for forgiveness, for restoration. Had his rage been sin? No, that didn't commute. The scriptures counseled, "Be angry and do not sin." So the anger itself was not wrong. What he did as a result of it clearly was. He had become consumed by rage and had allowed it to interfere with his relationship to God and to those he loved. Rayford had become isolated, living out his private ambitions. He had fought to see through his tears as God showed him his very self in its rawest state. "I'll understand," he prayed, "if I have disqualified myself from any role with the tribulation force." But God did not seem to confirm that. All Rayford felt was an overwhelming hunger and thirst for the Bible and for instruction. He wanted to pray like this from now on, to constantly be in touch with God as he had been when he first became a believer. What that meant to his role as head of the tribulation force, he didn't know. More important was getting back to the basics, getting back to God. Rayford found the cargo plane crew busy with their own work as he taxied a quarter of a mile north to park the Gulf Stream. They barely looked up as he hurried past on foot, his bag slung over his shoulder, as if he were headed somewhere specific. As soon as he emerged from the airfield's gated entrance and found a dark spot between road lamps, he phoned the Mikloses' home. Mrs. Miklos answered on the first ring. "This is your friend from America," he said, and she immediately switched from Greek to her very limited English. "Say code so I know," she said. Code? He didn't remember any code. Maybe that was something among the local believers. "Jesus is the Christ the Messiah," he said. "That not code," she said. "But I know voice. Saw on television." "You did? Me?" "Yes. Did you shoot Carpathia?" Rayford's mouth was dry, so the cameras had caught him. "No," he said. "At least I don't think so. I didn't mean to. What are they saying?" "Fingerprints," she said, "on gun." Rayford shook his head. He had been so certain that if he shot Carpathia, he would be immediately captured or killed, that he had not even worried about fingerprints. He hadn't considered escaping. Some criminal he was. Why didn't he think to wipe the handle on his robe before dropping the weapon? "Are they showing my face?" he asked. "Yes." He told her where he was and asked if Laszlo's was there. "No, with our shepherd, praying for you." "I don't want to compromise you," he said. "I'll just fly on to America." "Don't no compromise," she said. "Oh, sorry, give you away, get you in trouble, be seen with you." "Laszlo would not leave you alone," she said. "I tell him he call you." Rayford hated the idea of jeopardizing Greek believers, but Laszlo's English was better than his wife's, so perhaps Rayford would have an easier time dissuading him from becoming involved. He gave her the number and settled in to wait for the call in the shadows of the shrubbery off the makeshift road that led north out of the airport. Upstairs, in Rosenzweig's massive house, Buck used the flashlight sparingly as he searched for any sign of Chaim. From outside, he heard noises in the underbrush that paralyzed him. He held his breath and crept to the window, peering down while desperate to stay out of sight. Someone signaled a few others, and their shapes moved about in the darkness. He couldn't imagine a scenario that would allow him to escape until it played out before his eyes. Suddenly, all GC peacekeeping forces were rallied for one purpose: to find a fugitive. And when the multi-language announcement came over rolling bullhorns, it was clear whom they were looking for. "Attention, citizens and all global community personnel," came the announcements. "Be on the lookout for American Rayford Steele, former GC employee wanted in connection with the conspiracy to assassinate President Nikolai Carpathia. Maybe in disguise, maybe armed, considered dangerous. Qualified pilot. Any information about his whereabouts?" Rayford? Conspiracy? Now the GC was grasping at straws. From below, the GC peacekeepers appeared to be arguing whether one or more should stay. Finally, their leader barked at them and waved that they should follow. Buck waited a few minutes, then checked every window, staring into the night and listening for any enemy. He saw and heard nothing, but he knew time was his greatest adversary now. He saved Chaim's workshop till last. It had no windows, so when he threw open the door, he didn't hesitate to shine the flashlight all about. It was empty, but it also looked different from when he'd seen it last. Chaim had shown him his handiwork, but now there was no evidence of that. The place was spotless. Even the vices had been unfastened from the workbenches and stored. The floor was clean, tools hung, counters spotless. It almost looked the way it would if someone were moving or had another function in mind for the room. Buck backed out and closed the door. Something niggled at his mind. Despite the taste of fear and revulsion in his throat, he tucked the flashlight into his pocket and carefully made his way to the front door. The casing had been shattered. Though he was sure the GC had done this and abandoned the place, Buck felt safer leaving the way he had come. As he moved toward the back door, he wondered who had cleaned Chaim's workshop for him. Had he done it himself before the stroke, or had the staff done it after it became clear he would be unable to engage in his hobby? Buck felt his way through the sparse landscaping in the back and stopped frequently to listen for footsteps or breathing over the sirens and announcements from blocks away. He stayed out of the light and in the middle of earthquake rumble as much as he could until he found an area where the street lamps were out. He had to know for sure about Chain before he could even think about trying to rendezvous with Rayford or Leah. But where would he start? Not that long ago, Buck would have tried to find him through Jacob, Hannelore, her mother, or Stefan. As he broke into a jog, heading for who knew where, tears dripped from his face. Late Friday afternoon in Illinois, Chloe had been feeding Kenny in the other room when Rayford's photo, the one from his former GCID, came on television. Tyson blanched and bolted for the set to turn it down and listen from up close. Tyson had been praying for Rayford, worried about him. When Rayford and Leah and Buck had left, Tyson thought he knew their various assignments and missions, and he feared playing mere shuttle pilot would not be enough for Rayford. He had been in the middle of so much action, but for now, even more than the rest, merely a fugitive having to stay out of sight. Now, what would he do? The news implied he had fired the weapon that may have killed Carpathia. How could one do that in such a crowd and escape? Never had Tyson so wanted to talk to Rayford, and never had he felt such a burden to pray for a man. That compulsion was nothing new. It struck Tyson that he had spent more time in concerted prayer for Rayford than for any other individual. It was obvious why Rayford needed prayer now, of course, but when Tyson closed his eyes and covered them with a hand, he felt uncomfortable. He knew he would have to tell Chloe soon that her father was a suspect in the assassination, or the conspiracy, as the TV anchors called it, but that was not what made him fidgety. It seemed he was not in the proper posture to pray, and all he could make of that was that perhaps Rayford needed real intercession. Tyson had studied the discipline of intercession, largely a Protestant tradition from the fundamentalist and the Pentecostal cultures. Those steeped in it went beyond mere praying for someone as an act of interceding for them. They believed true intercession involved deep empathy, and that a person thus praying must not enter into the practice unless willing to literally trade places with the needy person. Tyson mentally examined his own willingness to truly intercede for Rayford. It was mere exercise. He could not trade places with Rayford and become a suspect in the murder of the Antichrist, but he could affect that posture in his mind. He could express his willingness to God to take that burden, literally possible or not. Yet even that did not assuage Tyson's discomfort. He tried dropping to one knee, bowing his head lower, then slipping to both knees, then turning to lay his arms on the seat of the couch and rest his head on his hands. He worried that Chloe would not understand if she saw him this way. Suddenly, not watching TV obsessively as he had since the assassination, but in a posture of total contrition, something foreign to his nature. He often prayed this way in private, of course, but Chloe would see this showing of humility. She would likely feel obligated to ask if he was all right. But these concerns were quickly overridden by Tyson's spiritual longings. He felt such deep compassion and pity for Rayford that he moaned involuntarily and felt himself sliding from the couch until his palms were flat on the floor. His head now pressing against the front of the couch, his body facing away from the near silent TV. He groaned and wept as he prayed silently for Rayford. Having not come from a tradition comfortable with unusual manifestations, Tyson was startled by a sudden lack of equilibrium. In his mind's eye, his focus had suddenly shifted from Rayford and his troubles to the majesty of God himself. Tyson at once felt unworthy and ashamed and impure, as if in the very presence of the Lord. Tyson knew that praying was figuratively bodily approaching the throne, but he had never felt such a physical proximity to the Creator God. Knees sliding back, palms forward, he lay prostrate, his forehead pressing into the musty carpet, nose mashed flat. But even that did not alleviate his lightheadedness. Tyson felt disembodied, as if the present were giving away. He was only vaguely aware of where he was, of the quiet drone of the television, of Chloe cooing and Kenny giggling, as she urged him to eat. Tyson. He did not respond, not immediately aware he was even conscious. Was this a dream? Tyson. The voice was feminine. Should I try the phone again? He opened his eyes, suddenly aware of the smell of the old carpet and the sting of tears. Huh? He managed, throat constricted, voice thick. Footsteps. I was wondering, should I try calling Tyson? Are you all right? He slowly pulled himself up. I'm fine, dear. Very tired all of a sudden. You have a right to be. Get some rest. Take a nap. I'll wake you if anything breaks. I won't let you miss anything. Tyson sat on the edge of the couch, shoulders slumped, hands entwined between his knees. I would be grateful, he said. He had nodded toward the other room. Is he all right for a minute? She nodded. You better sit down, he said. Chloe looked stricken. Was there news? Is Buck all right? Nothing from Buck or Leah, he said, and she seemed to finally exhale. But you need to know about your father. David tried emailing Viv Ivans a list of those in his department who might be available for double duty over the next few days, but the message bounced back undeliverable. He would go past her office on the way to the hangar anyway, so he printed out the message and took it with him. On the way, he received a call from the foundry foreman. You know what you're asking, don't you? The man said. Of course, Hans, David said. You have to know this didn't originate with me. Unless it's from Fortunato himself, I don't see how we can be expected, it is, to comply. I mean, this is way too, it is, enough said. David slipped the printout into the slot on Viv Ivan's door, but it was not shut out of the way and swung open. The small dark office immediately brightened as the motion sensor light came on. The gossip around the palace was that on occasion Carpathia's alleged aunt on his mother's side dozed for so long at her desk that her office went dark. If something woke her or caused her to move in her sleep, the lights came back on, and she resumed working as if nothing were awry. David made sure she wasn't in there dozing, then reached to shut the door. But something on her desk caught his eye. She had laid out a map of the world, boundaries between the 10 regions clearly marked. It was nothing he hadn't seen before, except that this was an old map, one drawn when the 10 regions were members of the newly expanded United Nations Security Council. When Carpathia had renamed this one world government the global community, he had also slightly renamed the 10 regions. For instance, the United States of North America became the United North American States. Viv Ivans had not only handwritten these adjustments, but she had also added numbers and parentheses after each name. David felt conspicuous and nosy, but who knew what significance this might hold for the tribulation force, the Judites tribulation saints around the world. He concocted his alibi as he moved toward the desk. If Viv were to return and catch him studying her map, he would simply tell the truth about the door tripping a light and the map catching his eye. How he would explain his scribbling the numbers, he did not know. With one last look out her office window, David grabbed a business card from his wallet and wrote furiously in tiny script as he bent over Viv's map. The United Holy States 216, the United Russian States 72, the United Indian States 42, the United Asian States 30, the United Pacific States 18, the United North American States -6, the United South American States 0, the United Great Britain States 2, the United European States 6, and the United African States 7. David traced the asterisk after the United Holy Land States to the bottom of the map where Viv or someone had noted in faint tiny pencil marks, aka the United Carpathian States. That was a new one. David had never heard another moniker for the Holy Land States. As he was straightening to leave, he saw more pencil writings that appeared to have been erased. He bent close and squinted, but needed more light. Dare he turn on Viv's desk lamp? No, rather, he held the whole map up to the ceiling light, knowing he would simply have to confess to pathological curiosity if necessary. He only hoped that Viv, like nearly everyone else in the compound, was watching Carpathia's body being transported from the Phoenix 216 to the morgue. He was glad to miss that, knowing that most would hold hands or hats over their hearts, and he wasn't prepared to do that even as a ruse. With the overhead light shining brightly, though, through the map, David was barely able to make out the erasures. It appeared someone had written only caveat HL highest, NA lowest. David shook his head as he carefully replaced the map and headed out. Viv Ivins was coming toward him. "Oh, David," she said, "I wish you could have seen the spontaneous outpouring of emotion. I'm sure there'll be a lot of that over the next few days. But to see the workers, the soldiers, everybody, oh, it was moving. The salutes, the tears. Oh, did I leave my light on?" David explained the door, tripping the motion sensor. "And your list is in the door?" He nodded, and his phone rang, startling him so that he nearly left his feet. "Carry on," Viv said. It was Mac. David talked as he walked. "Half thought you'd be here to greet us," Mac said. "Corporal Christopher waited on the evidence until the pallbearers got the body out of here." "The evidence? I don't think I've ever seen pallbearers in dress unis carrying a big old wood crate like it was a polished mahogany casket. Where were you?" "On my way, but what did you say about evidence?" "Annie's offloading it now. Couple of huge plastic trash bags full of pieces of the lectern, and another crate with apparently the whole fabric backdrop of the stage. Moon wouldn't let us leave Jerusalem without it. You heard about the weapon, right?" "Course, and our friend. Funny thing, though, David. Yeah, I better save this for in person." "Rayford here. Mr. Steele," came the easily recognized voice of Lucas Miklos. "Where are you?" Rayford told him. "Stay in the shadows, but walk 3 kilometers north. We will pick you up north of the 3 kilometer marker. When you see a white four-door slow and leave the road, run to us. If there's any traffic, we may pass and come back. But when we pull off, do not hesitate." "We are under Shepard and me. Laszlo's? I don't want to ask you two to risk." "Nonsense. Do you have an alias and appropriate papers?" "I do." "Good. How fast can you walk?" "How's the terrain?" "Not the best, but don't get near the road until we get there." "I'm starting now. Mr. Steele, we feel just like the prayer meeting people from the New Testament praying for Peter while he knocked on their door." "Yeah," Rayford said, only he was coming from prison. Exhausted, Buck sat behind a concrete wall, built decades before to protect Israel from shrapnel and mortar from nearby enemies. He was several blocks from the main drag, but close enough to hear the ever-present sirens and see the emergency lights bouncing off the low-riding clouds in the wee hours. Think, he told himself. He didn't want to leave Israel without knowing where Chaim was. Buck knew of no other people Chaim might flee to or wish if he had somehow survived. If Chaim had defied the odds, he would be looking for Buck as fervently as Buck was looking for him. They could not meet at the obvious places: Buck's hostel, Chaim's house, Jacob's apartment, Stefan's place. What would make sense to both of them? Buck had never believed in extrasensory perception, but he sure wished there was something to it now. He wished he could sense whether the old man was all right, and if so, that he was trying to somehow communicate with Buck right then. As a believer, Buck was certain that clairvoyance was hogwash, but he had heard credible stories of people, particularly Christians, who somehow knew things supernaturally. Surely it wasn't beyond God's ability to perform such miracles, especially now. Buck needed a miracle, but his faith was weak. He knew it shouldn't be. He had seen enough from God in 3.5 years that he should never again doubt for an instant. What held him up now was that he was dead sure he didn't deserve a miracle. Weren't there bigger, more important things for God to worry about? People with dying, injured, lost. And there were the great supernatural battles between good and evil that Tyson wrote so much about. The conflict of the ages that had spilled out of heaven and now plagued the earth. "I'm sorry to even ask," Buck prayed, but at least calm me down, give me a clear mind, just long enough to figure this. If Chaim is alive, let us run into each other or both think of a meeting place that makes sense. Buck felt foolish, stupid, petty. Finding Chaim was noble, but involving God in such a trivial matter seemed, well, rude. He stood and felt the aches. He clenched his fist and grimaced. Relax. Get a hold of yourself. Think. But somehow he knew that was no way to open his mind. He had to really relax, and berating himself for being frantic would have the opposite effect. But how could he calm himself at a time like this, when it was all he could do to catch his breath and will his pulse to decelerate? Maybe that was an appropriate request of God, a miracle enough in itself. Buck sat back down, confident he was hidden and alone. He breathed deeply and exhaled slowly, shaking out his hands and stretching his legs. He laid his head back and felt the concrete wall against his hair and scalp. He let his head roll from side to side. His breathing became slower and more even. His pulse began to subside ever so slowly. He tucked his chin to his chest and tried to clear his mind. The only way to do that was to pray for his comrades one by one, starting with his own wife and son, his father-in-law, and all the rest of the brothers and sisters who came to mind. He thanked God for friends now in heaven, including those whose bodies he had just discovered. And almost before he knew it, he had calmed as much as a man could in that situation. Thank you, Lord. Now what location would make sense? Where have Chaim and I been together that we would both think of? He pictured them at Teddy Kolik Stadium, but that was too public, too open. Neither could risk it. And then it came to him. And that's the end of chapter 4. Next, I'll be reading chapter 5. Thank you for joining me. Have a wonderful day.